Undercover boss grabs toast stops cold when she says we can't pay bills. The sound of a knife slicing through a crispy loaf of bread echoed softly in the warm light of Brooklyn Roast Cafe, a small coffee spot tucked along Lenox Street in the heart of a bustling working-class neighborhood in Queens, New York. Mornings here weren't rushed like Midtown nor cold like upscale cafes in Manhattan. The customers were mostly construction workers, healthcare staff, and teachers. People who started their day with a strong Americano and a simple buttered toast. At a table near the espresso counter, Michael Foster, 50 years old, founder of the Sunrise Cafe chain, sat quietly in a gray jacket and a low-pulled beanie. No one recognized him. In his hand was a worn leather notebook and an old fountain pen, as if he were just a writer jotting down ideas for a morning story. But Michael wasn't writing. He was listening. Right behind him, a young waitress poured coffee for a customer. Her voice was so soft it was barely audible. But in one brief moment when she leaned close to the counter, the small clipped near Michael's ear amplified everything. "We can't even cover the electricity bill this month. Tips from yesterday didn't even reach $20. There was no anger in her voice, only fear mixed with a hint of embarrassment, like someone confessing a truth they themselves didn't want to hear again. Michael froze. The buttered toast still sat in his hand, but its taste had vanished. The initial warmth of the cafe evaporated like the steam from the cooling coffee before him. He looked up. The girl, probably mid-20s, was still smiling. Still moving, still pouring coffee for a new customer. Still nodding and thanking people as if everything in her life was fine. But no one in the cafe knew that just 5 seconds ago she had admitted something no one her age should have to say. Michael committed it to memory, the words, the tone, the timing. And the eyes, that look it used to be his mother's. In the kitchen, in 1983, holding a towel to bear the heat from a pot of boiling water. That same look when she'd say, "It's okay, honey. I'm fine. Just a little tired." No one at Brooklyn Roast Cafe knew the man with the pen not touching his breakfast was the one who had built the very chain they worked for. And he had just heard what no one dared to say out loud. That girl, her name still unknown to him, had awakened something in Michael. He lowered the toast back to the plate carefully, as if not to disturb the stillness of the moment. He watched her a few seconds longer. Not to judge, but to see what others didn't. She turned away quickly, stuffing a receipt into her apron pocket, the motion just slightly too fast. As if afraid someone might notice, a mini-twist began to form in Michael's mind. Why couldn't she pay the electric bill if she worked full-time? Why were yesterday's tips so low despite a steady stream of customers? And why was she still smiling, still pouring, with no one around her sensing anything was off? Michael quickly scribbled into his notebook, "Waitress, fearful tone. Excessive self-control issue is not customers. It's internal." The cafe remained gentle like the jazz humming from the corner speaker. An old Billie Holiday track played, the saxophone weaving between the clinking glasses being dried behind the bar. No one noticed the quiet details breathing in that morning, except Michael. And now he was no longer just a customer. He was a father, a founder, a man who once promised himself that Sunrise Cafe would be a place where employees were respected, not just servers. And today, that promise was being tested by one small sentence, powerful enough to shake an entire system. Michael took a deep breath. The pen was still in his hand, but this time he didn't write. He watched and waited to see how the facade might begin to crack, and whether he still had time to make things right. Brooklyn Roast Cafe sat tucked behind a busy intersection in Queens, New York. Not large, not flashy. But there was something quietly distinct about this place, as if it was holding on to the breath of the city just out of view. Morning light poured through the wide glass windows. Golden rays stretched across the dark wood tables, touching a freshly made cappuccino and casting shadows on the porcelain saucer. Inside, the soft hum of vintage jazz fell like droplets from the espresso machine, gentle but haunting. A spoon clinked gently against a glass in the left corner. Customers chatted in low, familiar tones. Most were locals, a hospital worker, a delivery driver, a young teacher waiting for her morning class. But no one noticed one thing. The morning shift's main waitress, dark circles under her eyes, dry lips, a smile just enough to not raise concern. Her name was Sophie. Around 24 years old, Sophie moved with the practiced ease of someone who had been in service long enough to tell the type of customer just by how they held the menu. She said thank you with the same rhythm every time she set a bill down. But if you looked closely, you'd see it the way her eyes drifted for a few seconds each time she turned away, like her mind had been pulled somewhere far off. Sophie was trying to live up to what her uniform asked of her polite professional and smiling. But everyone at some point learns how to smile through despair. Michael knew that better than anyone. He sat by the window disguised as a familiar passerby. A pale khaki jacket, a gray beanie pulled low, and a leather notebook open before him like a writer searching for material for an unnamed novel. No one recognized him as Michael Foster, founder of Sunrise, the chain once praised for its humane culture and fair policies. Michael didn't look at Sophie directly, but he listened to every movement. He took note of how she poured coffee, how she stepped quietly into the kitchen, and the way she spun around quickly, sharply, to tuck a cash tip into her apron just before the manager approached. The manager's name was Nina, around 35. Her hair tied neatly at the back, her lips always painted a muted orange. Her tone was sweet, just enough to make guests feel welcomed. But when she turned away, her eyes sharpened.
She checked everything: brew temperatures, service speed, cup cleanliness, even restroom breaks.
Nina didn't need to raise her voice. Just one look, and everyone knew who was moving too slowly. Behind the bar, the head chef, no one knew his name, worked in silence. He rarely stepped out, but Michael noticed something strange. Even though the caf wasn't busy, the chef's face stayed tense like a pulled wire. He didn't make eye contact. He kept his head down, and when Nina walked by, his hands instinctively gripped the knife handle tighter as if reacting to danger. Michael jotted a note into his book, head chef on edge. No sense of ease. Nina controls more than just the workflow. Not long after, a regular customer male around 50 wearing reading glasses offered a few extra dollars as tip when paying. He smiled at Sophie and reached to hand the money directly to her. But Nina appeared immediately, still speaking softly, just leave it with me. It gets shared fairly. She took the money and dropped it into a zip bag behind the counter without another word.
Sophie just nodded, didn't resist.
But then, in a rare moment, Michael saw her hand clench just for a split second before opening again and continuing her work. Michael glanced around. No one noticed. The caf ran like a stage-led rolls, a director, backstage crew, and unspoken lines never to be said aloud. The first mini twist appeared here. Customer tips clearly meant for the server. Why were they pooled? Why was there no public breakdown? And why did Nina always appear the moment someone tried to give a tip directly? Michael wrote more tip system, not transparent. Staff avoids speaking when management is near. Customers unaware of what happens behind the bar. Another detail caught his eye. After each rush, Sophie had to wash glasses herself, no support staff. She made the drinks served and cleaned while Nina just stood watching, occasionally adjusting the music.
Sophie never complained.
But no one in their 20s should have to learn submission this early. When Sophie went into the kitchen for more milk, Michael heard her cough. Not from the cold, from exhaustion. And he knew the time for silence had passed. This was no longer about a cup of morning coffee. It was about a system slowly drifting from the ideals he once built. Not because the customers were unkind, not because the caf wasn't busy, but somewhere in the chain of hands, someone was profiting from the silence of those who needed a voice the most. Michael closed his notebook. The truth was beginning to reveal itself. At the back of the caf behind the counter, a young busboy was quickly wiping a spilled coffee stain. Michael walked over, casually picked up a glass of warm water, and gently asked, was the morning shift crowded? The young man gave a small nod, then hesitated, speaking just loud enough for only 2 people to hear. Here, if you don't smile bright enough, you're likely to get your hours cut, sir. Michael froze. It sounded like a casual remark, but its meaning landed like ice. Not skill. Not work ethic. Just smiling bright enough. He glanced up to see Sophie still swiftly clearing a table near the window, the same smile still on her face. But after that sentence, that smile no longer reassured him. A tall barista behind the espresso machine chimed in, seeing Michael linger. Sophie once asked to switch to evening shifts to save for rent. But Nina shut her down. He cast a glance toward the shift manager, then lowered his voice. She said Sophie's face didn't match the evening vibe, worried it might kill the customer mood. Michael looked at Sophie again. There was nothing unappealing about her face. Only her eyes, though, always open wide and polite, carried a flicker of something. Weary. He opened his leather notebook and began jotting the details slowly. But before he could close it, an older customer, seemingly a regular, placed his tray down and walked over. "First time here?" the man asked. Michael nodded. "Just dropped by. Heard the pastries were good, coffee decent." The man gave a small smile. "Yeah, food's good. But I feel bad for that waitress." Michael kept a neutral expression, but his eyes narrowed slightly. The customer lowered his voice. "I come here every morning. One day I saw her dozing off in the corner. Asked her about it, and she said she had to sleep in her friend's car the night before.
Said she left early to skip the afternoon meal.
Trying to save on lunch money." Michael let go of the notebook. He wasn't writing anymore. His heart slowed, like it had just brushed up against something no one wants to hear but must. This wasn't just about tips. It wasn't just about a manager's cold tone. This was about a young woman choosing between rest and saving a few dollars. About survival hidden behind polite speech. About dignity being eroded day by day beneath the golden glow of a cafe where people care more about the vibe than the people. He looked out the window. The sky was blue today.
Soft sunlight stretched across the sidewalk.
People were laughing, sipping coffee, enjoying a peaceful morning. And inside, someone was skipping meals just to avoid being a burden to the next shift. Michael tightened his grip on the notebook. The notes now felt like testimony, not for evaluating performance, but for confronting the cracks that had been papered over with stories of even weekend splits and fairness for all. At the table near the door, Sophie bent down to pick up a fallen cloth. Such a small gesture, but the way she did it gently, as if afraid to drop anyone's trust along with it, made Michael's throat tighten. Wages could be shorted, but dignity, no one had the right to take that away. He quietly returned to his seat. The coffee was still warm, but he didn't drink it. He placed his hand on the table, running his fingers slowly across the surface, as if feeling the thin layer of dust that injustice had left untouched. He knew then that his journey was no longer a survey. It had become a deep dive to see what his system had truly left behind for those on the front lines. And he also knew Sophie's story had only just begun to surface. The wall clock struck 10:20. Sunlight began to slant through the large windows, casting light across the pastry counter where Sophie was rearranging croissants as if she had baked them herself. Everything in the cafe moved as it did on any normal morning. Customers sipping coffee. A few typing away on laptops. The soft hum of the coffee grinder in the background. But for Michael, every detail was becoming evidence. He walked toward the back where the dishwashing station was tucked out of view. A young employee's sleeves, still damp, silently stacked cups on the shelf. Michael handed him a paper towel, pretending to dry his hands, then gently asked, "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 3 months," the boy replied quietly without looking up. "Are the tips consistent?" The boy paused for a second, then whispered as if afraid someone might hear when we get them, "It's less than what customers give. But if we ask, they say it's a system entry error." Michael gave a slight nod, asking no more. He didn't need to. That one sentence alone revealed more than enough. Leaving the back area, he moved to the barista counter where a tall young man was stacking plastic cups. His name was Louis. He looked more confident, sturdier than the others. But when Michael asked, "Are tips divided fairly here?" Louis let out a sigh, glancing toward Nina, who was standing at the counter. "She keeps them all. Says she'll split them later in the week, but we've never seen a tip breakdown." "Never," Michael repeated. Louis nodded, eyes fixed on the coffee machine. "She says, trust me. But after enough times, even the newbies figure it out. Trusting just leaves you hungry." A moment of silence. Lewis went back to work. Michael remained still feeling as if he had stepped one level deeper into the basement of truth where trust was used as a shield for injustice. In the corner of the cafe, Sophie was still smiling at customers. When the last guest at table 3 stood up, she quickly cleared the cups, wiped the table, then headed toward the backroom office behind the pastry counter. It was payday. Michael sat at his table pretending to check his phone, but his eyes followed her via the small mirror mounted above the bar. Sophie emerged. She held a small envelope in her hand. She stood there for a few seconds, staring at the number on the printed slip inside. No frown. No visible disappointment. Just stillness. Then softly, she folded it, slipped it into her apron pocket, and turned away. But she didn't head back to the counter. Instead, she veered into the narrow space behind the espresso machine. Lewis quickly stepped aside. And in that moment, Michael saw something no CEO ever wants to see.
Sophie brought her hand to her face.
Not quite crying, but clearly wiping something. A small gesture, very fast.
Behind the loosely tied hair, a lowered head, as if she had just swallowed something no one should have to witness.
Michael felt a tightness in his chest. His hand instinctively clenched the edge of his notebook. A young woman smiling at guests with the kindest smile she could offer. But one payroll slip was enough to make her retreat behind the machine, away from sight, just to take a proper breath. It wasn't about the paycheck. It was about dignity. No one should have to wipe their tears in a place they help build every day. Michael stood up quietly, walking toward the pastry counter. As he passed, he saw Lewis still stacking cups. Their eyes met for a moment. No words exchanged. But Lewis gave a subtle nod. Michael didn't nod back. He simply turned his gaze toward the manager's office. Because he knew it was time to lift his head. The espresso machine sputtered. Sophie was wiping the coffee dust off the machine's casing, her eyes fixed as if keeping her hands busy to avoid thinking. Michael placed his notebook on the table. He stood walking toward the counter. His steps were slow, noiseless, as if not to disturb the morning rhythm, but his eyes were steady. "Sophie," he said softly. She turned around, slightly surprised. That look in her eyes, though still smiling, couldn't hide the alertness that had formed from too many times being watched. Michael lowered his head, his voice just audible. "May I ask, how are the tips?" Shared here a light question. But within it, Sophie heard something unusual. She froze. Before she could answer, a syrup-sweet female voice cut in. "We collect tips at the end of each week and distribute them evenly across the whole shift. It's a policy from headquarters." Nina? The team lead appeared without a sound, still wearing her usual smile, slightly leaning toward the guest as if the previous conversation had never happened. Michael turned to look at her. His eyes weren't smiling, just quiet, as if weighing every word she had just spoken.
"So, where's the breakdown posted?" Nina hesitated for a moment.
Then regained her rhythm. "Oh, since the software sometimes glitches, we handle it internally and send out a printed version." Later, Sophie glanced over her expression, briefly unsettled. Michael didn't press further. He nodded politely. But in his gaze, the audience knew he had heard enough. He walked back to his table. No one noticed that as he passed, he lightly touched the counter surface exactly where Sophie had wiped her tears that morning. A small touch, but enough to preserve a feeling. And when Michael sat down, he didn't open his notebook. Instead, he reached into his shirt pocket and took out his phone. On the screen was the internal interface of the Sunrise system. He opened the branch management section, scrolled to internal feedback. Under the heading Queens Location, Brooklyn Roast Cafe, he began typing, "Special audit request, submit security footage from the last 3 days. Focus on shift closing times, cashier area." He didn't send it right away. Instead, he looked around one staff member at a time. Lewis was checking stock in the back. The dishwasher was still working quietly. Sophie had her back turned, continuing to wipe down the counter. Only Nina stood still.
She was talking to a customer, but her eyes were still on Michael.
The confrontation, though not yet official, had already begun in silence. And that silence itself was the first bell. Michael put away his phone. And this time, instead of continuing to pose as an ordinary customer, he stood up and walked toward the door. Right before pushing it open, he turned a single angle that captured the entire calf, the slanting warm light, and Sophie bending down to pick up a fallen towel. He whispered to himself, no one should have to bend down just to retrieve what was always rightfully theirs. And then he stepped outside. The morning breeze brushed gently against his collar. The audience no longer needed loud words, because in that silence they could feel something had shifted. Softly. But clearly, Michael returned to the calf in the late afternoon. Same simple outfit, same unhurried gait, but this time he didn't sit down. He stood right in the middle of the calf, removed his beanie. The light touched the silver streaks in his hair, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I am Michael Foster, he spoke. Calm, slow, but resonating like a morning bell. The founder of Sunrise Calf. The spoon in Sophie's hand dropped onto the table. The soft clink rang out like a crack in a surface that had long appeared unbroken. Nina froze.
She was standing behind the counter, still holding the coffee pot mid-pour. A stream of coffee spilled across the surface, but she no longer noticed.
A young busboy instinctively straightened his posture. Lewis looked up from behind the bar. Everyone. It was as if time had just stopped. Michael took out his phone. The screen displayed the internal system logo. He opened a document, turned the screen toward Nina, and spoke calmly. This is from the Franchise Agreement Section 7, Line 12. Tips are the direct right of employees. Any act of withholding, delaying, or interfering with the distribution of tips is considered a violation of operational ethics. No one spoke, but Michael's gaze said everything. In addition, he continued, still not raising his voice, no one has the right to cut working hours because a face is not cheerful enough. Sunrise is not run by appearances, but by kindness and labor. Sophie clenched the rag in her hands. She didn't look away, just stared straight ahead. But her lips pressed tightly together as if holding back something from spilling out. Michael looked at her for a moment, then gave a slight nod, a silent promise. Right then, a man in a navy blue shirt entered. No one had noticed he'd been sitting in the corner all morning, also eating toast, also drinking cappuccino, also taking notes. Regional supervisor, he said softly, showing his badge. In his hand was a tablet. A video clip was playing on the screen. Everyone turned their eyes to it. Footage from the kitchen camera, high clarity, Nina holding several small envelopes. Each one labeled with a name, but she didn't hand them out. She placed them into a drawer and locked it. Then looked around, her expression unhurried. Next clip. The audio was a bit static-filled, but every word was clear. You're not looking cheerful enough today, Sophie. Guests pick up on that kind of vibe easily. Sophie stood at the counter holding a milk jug. She didn't speak, but her shoulders were stiff, as if resisting something all too familiar. The calf fell completely silent. Nina took a step back. I was just following standard procedures, she said softly, her voice clearly shaking. Michael didn't respond. He looked at each employee in turn. The young barista gripped his apron tightly. The dishwasher bowed his head slightly. And Sophie, she stood still. But this time, her hands no longer trembled. Any viewer watching at this point would feel as if they were right there in that room. Tension heavy. But justice being named. Michael calmly closed his phone. And then in the midst of that weighted silence, he said just one sentence: no one has the right to demand a smile from someone who is not being treated fairly. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, the resolution, where emotional release and decisive action peak, giving the audience a powerful and satisfying close? Michael looked directly at Sophie. Then he turned and walked to the center of the calf, where every gaze now rested on him. Starting today, he said, his voice not loud, but each word landing like a command that made everyone hold still. All tips will be updated in real time. No more weekly splits. No more holding back. No more passing through any intermediary hands. A breath caught in the air. The dishwashing girl looked up. The barista by the espresso machine instinctively touched his apron as if asking himself, is this real? Michael turned, stepped towards Sophie. He pulled a thick envelope from his leather bag, sealed and carefully handwritten on top. Sophie. He handed it to her, gently. This is your official contract, Michael said. Full time. It includes all back-paid tips withheld since the beginning of the month, 3 months of housing assistance, and a regional transit pass. Sophie didn't have time to react. She just stood still, both hands holding the envelope, her thumbs trembling from trying to hold it in. Michael looked at her, not with the eyes of a boss, but of someone who had witnessed something far beyond profit. You don't have to smile out of fear anymore, he said softly. No one should survive by carrying an unjust system with a forced smile. Then he paused for a moment. This system was built to protect you, not to exploit your kindness. The whole calf fell silent. But emotions, they surged like an undercurrent within each person. The regional supervisor stepped forward and nodded at Michael. Nina has been suspended. The internal audit department will take over later today. No applause. No cheers. But the glances exchanged between people, that was a different kind of affirmation. The kind that comes from those who have stayed silent, swallowed their voices just to keep a shift, now seeing something they thought wasn't real justice. Sophie still said nothing. She quietly stepped behind the counter where the new payroll slip had just been placed in the HR tray. She picked it up. The number wasn't that big, but for the first time, it was hers. Truly hers. No longer withheld. No longer a clenched wait until end-of-week distribution. And then, for the first time, right in the middle of a crowded calf, Sophie cried, but this time, not out of helplessness, but relief. She hugged the envelope tightly, then turned to Michael, said nothing, just nodded. Eyes still wet, but her lips curved into a smile that no longer had to be forced. Michael didn't need to say anything else. He just looked around the calf at each face that just that morning hadn't yet found the courage to look up. Now things were different. Michael gently pushed open the door of Brooklyn Roast Calf, stepping out just as the sun reached its midday peak. A breeze passed through, carrying the scent of freshly ground coffee and the echo of what had just taken place inside. He paused for a moment, his hand brushing the hem of his coat as if to hold on to the final warmth of the conversation just now. Through the window in front of him, he looked inside.
Sophie was still behind the counter.
Her hair now neatly tied, no longer messy like it was that morning. But what made Michael stop and really look was the smile on her face. Not forced. Not for the customer. Not to keep the shift. But the smile of someone who had just been returned to herself. She leaned slightly to greet an elderly customer, carefully poured each drop of coffee. Her hands still steady on the tray, but her eyes now carried something clear trust. Michael smiled, then quietly took out his leather notebook and wrote a single line: coffee tastes good when the beans are roasted right. But a system is trustworthy when it knows how to keep good people. That line wasn't meant to be quoted. It was a reminder to him and to anyone who had ever believed kindness was too small to survive inside a giant machine. Inside the calf, the atmosphere had changed. No chanting, no thunderous applause. Just a few exchanged glances, a nod, and then people bent back to their work, but now with a gentler rhythm. A quiet acknowledgement, the way true justice always works. No speeches. No red-stamped memos. Just one person brave enough to stand up in silence. One question asked at the right time. One promise fulfilled immediately with no delay. The audience, if they've been watching from the beginning, didn't just see a bad person exposed. They witnessed a system being fixed. Right then. Right there. Not tomorrow. Not a vague, we'll look into it. And what made it satisfying wasn't a dramatic twist. It was the relief of seeing someone truly care, truly take action without ever having to raise their voice. It may have started with just a piece of toast, a cup of coffee, and a whisper that seemed trivial in a quiet morning. Yesterday's tips didn't even hit $20, But for Michael Foster, for Sophie, for everyone who's ever had to smile, just to keep their job, that small detail was the wake-up call. And for the viewers, it was proof. Justice doesn't need to be grand to begin. Sometimes it just takes a CEO who's willing to listen, and one brave server who refuses to give up.